John had been working as a night guard at a warehouse for a year. The warehouse was located on the outskirts of the city, near an abandoned industrial zone. At first, the job seemed simple. You sit there all night, occasionally walk around the building to check if everything is in order, and that's it. But recently, John started noticing strange things happening at night. The first thing that disturbed him was the sudden power outages. At first, he thought it was just regular power interruptions, but then he realized it only happened when he was alone at the warehouse. Every time the lights went out, John heard something moving in the dark, even though there shouldn't have been anyone there. John's colleagues laughed at his stories, saying he just had an overactive imagination. However, he knew it wasn't just in his head. The sounds grew louder and closer each time. He started feeling a presence, as if someone invisible was standing next to him, watching his every move. One night, when John was alone again, he decided to record everything that happened on a voice recorder. He wanted to prove to his colleagues that he wasn't going crazy. As soon as the lights went out again, he started the recording. Darkness enveloped him, and in the silence, he heard faint whispering coming from the corners of the room. The whispering grew louder, but he couldn't make out any words. John strained to catch something, anything. Suddenly, he heard his own name, spoken in a soft but clear voice. He froze, not believing his ears. "Who's there?" he asked, but the only reply was the echo of his own voice. John quickly turned on the lights. As soon as the lamps flickered on, the whispering stopped instantly, and everything returned to the usual silence. The warehouse felt normal again, but John's heart was still racing. He listened to the recording, but the tape only captured his own breathing and silence. The next day, John tried to tell his boss what had happened, but the man just smiled and suggested John needed more rest. "You get tired at night, that's why you hear all this nonsense," the boss said. But John knew it wasn't just his imagination. He could feel that something sinister was happening in the warehouse. That night, when John was back on duty, he decided to walk through the entire warehouse and carefully inspect every room. He took a flashlight with him and set off on his rounds. The dark, dusty corridors and cold steel walls filled him with unease, but he tried to stay calm. The longer he walked, the more uncomfortable he felt. As he approached the door to the most remote room, John felt his hand tremble as he reached for the handle. The door was slightly ajar, though he distinctly remembered closing it the previous night. The creaking sound was piercing as he cautiously opened the door. The room was empty, but John immediately noticed an old, dusty box in the corner that hadn't been there before. He stepped closer and bent down to examine it. The box was sealed with old tape, but it looked as though it had been brought there recently. John felt a strange urge to open it, despite the growing sense of dread inside him. With some effort, he ripped the tape and opened the box slightly, peering inside. Inside were old, yellowed papers and photographs. John picked up one of the photos and examined it. The picture showed a group of workers standing by the warehouse gate. He immediately recognized the location, but something about the people seemed off. Each one had a forced, strange smile, and their eyes looked empty. Flipping through the papers, John found reports and journals kept by warehouse workers decades ago. The pages contained records of strange incidents, missing goods, disappearances, accidents that no one could explain. With each line he read, John's sense of horror grew. He put everything back in the box and hurried to close it, but then he heard footsteps behind him. John quickly turned around but saw no one. Yet the footsteps continued. He could feel someone approaching him. The flashlight in his hand trembled, but he couldn't illuminate the source of the sound. The light started to dim, and suddenly the flashlight went out, leaving John in complete darkness. He tried to turn it back on, but it was useless. The footsteps grew louder, as if someone was getting closer and closer. "Who's there?" he repeated, but all he heard in response was the empty sound of his own voice. Suddenly, something cold touched his shoulder, and John jerked sideways, but again saw no one. He dashed out of the room and ran down the corridor back to his post. Adrenaline surged through his veins, and his heart felt like it would explode from his chest. All he wanted was to get outside and leave this cursed place. Back at his guard post, John quickly turned on the lights throughout the building. It seemed like the darkness retreated with each light he switched on, but the fear and the feeling that he wasn't alone didn't go away. He sat down at the desk and tried to calm himself, but his hands continued to tremble. The next few hours passed in silence, but John couldn't relax. Every rustle or creak seemed to him a sign of approaching danger. He felt he couldn't leave without finding out what was happening in the warehouse. Too many questions remained unanswered. The next morning, when another guard arrived to take over, John told him about his findings. His colleague just smirked, saying he too had found those old papers but hadn't given them any thought. "It's just old junk," he said. "The past, nothing to do with us." But John couldn't let it go. He decided to investigate further. In the following days, when he wasn't on duty, he visited city archives, read old newspapers and documents. He discovered that strange things had indeed happened at the warehouse. In the 80s, there were several accidents there, after which the warehouse was shut down for a long time. It turned out that the place had long had a bad reputation. People who worked there said they often felt like someone was watching them. Some claimed to have seen shadows or heard whispers in empty rooms. John realized that all these stories might be true. Soon he stumbled upon an article about the mysterious disappearance of several workers who were supposed to renovate the warehouse in the 90s. Their bodies were never found, and the case was left unsolved. However, the articles mentioned that the workers' colleagues heard strange noises and saw flickering lights before their disappearance. These findings only deepened John's confusion. He realized he needed to learn more about the past of this place to understand what he was dealing with. But the more he learned, the stronger his desire to leave the job became. He felt that the mysterious forces at the warehouse were starting to affect his sanity. The following night, when John returned to work, he decided to patrol the warehouse again. He was determined to figure everything out and get answers to the questions that haunted him. This time, he brought a camera with him, hoping to capture anything that might confirm his suspicions. As soon as John started his rounds, the lights went out again. This time he was ready. He turned on the camera, but the screen showed only empty darkness. Suddenly, the camera caught movement in one of the corridors. He aimed his flashlight there, but saw nothing. The camera continued to pick up something strange, a figure flickering at the end of the corridor. John headed in that direction, trying to move quietly. He felt a chill run down his spine when he realized the figure was moving deeper and deeper into the warehouse. His heart pounded so loudly it seemed to echo through the entire building. Suddenly, the figure disappeared, and the camera showed nothing again. John stopped and looked around. Everything around him was engulfed in a deafening silence that seemed unnatural. He turned on the flashlight again and aimed it at one of the doors. The door slowly began to open, even though no one was touching it. John felt his blood freeze. He couldn't believe his eyes. From the darkness, two eyes stared back at him, but in the light of the flashlight, they appeared empty, like those of the people in the old photograph. It was impossible, but the figure standing before him was a person, or what once had been a person. Unable to move, John stood there, staring at the figure. Suddenly, it began to slowly approach him. John felt his legs root to the ground, and he couldn't move. The darkness around him grew thicker, and a strange noise filled his ears, like the moans of countless souls. As the figure got closer, it whispered something into his ear. John couldn't make out the words, but the cold that shot through his entire body made him shudder. Finally, he mustered all his strength and dashed to the side, crashing through the door with his shoulder. He ran without looking back, trying not to think about what might be following him. When John reached his post, he realized his camera was still recording. He stopped and reviewed the footage. His heart sank. On the screen was the figure standing right behind him as he ran. John turned off the camera and frantically looked around, but there was no one there. With trembling hands, he locked the door and leaned against it, trying to catch his breath. But he knew he could no longer work at this warehouse. Everything he had seen and heard couldn't just be a figment of his imagination. But what exactly had he seen? And what was he supposed to do with this knowledge? The next few nights, John spent at the warehouse, avoiding the dangerous areas. But the fear didn't leave him, and he began to notice that the shadows were watching him, even when nothing was happening. He started seeing the outline of the figure even in the light, and this feeling began to haunt him not only at work but at home too. John began doubting his sanity. He tried to find a logical explanation for what was happening to him, but all his efforts were in vain. The fear consumed every part of his life. His friends and family started noticing that he had become withdrawn and irritable, but he didn't tell anyone about his experiences. After a while, John started noticing changes in his behavior. He was plagued by constant nightmares, in which he found himself back at that warehouse again and again. He would wake up in a cold sweat, unable to distinguish between dream and reality. His world was slowly falling apart, and he didn't know how to stop it. One night, while on duty, John heard those same footsteps again. But this time they didn't stop. They kept going, growing louder and louder. Darkness enveloped him, and he realized that this time he wouldn't be able to escape. The footsteps drew nearer, and with each moment, he felt the paralyzing fear taking over him. Suddenly, the figure appeared before him. Now it looked even more terrifying, its eyes glowing with a dead light. John realized that this creature had come for him. The darkness engulfed him, and everything around him disappeared, leaving him alone with this horror. He tried to scream, but his voice betrayed him. The figure came closer, and John felt the cold envelop his body. He knew this was the end. The creature reached out to him, and the world around him faded. The last thing he felt was the icy, deathly touch on his skin, and John plunged into the abyss. The next morning, when the new guard arrived for his shift, he didn't find John at his post. The entire warehouse was empty, as if no one had been working there all night. In the security office, the guard found only the camera lying on the table. The recording was cut off midway, showing only a dark corridor. Soon the management called the police, but a search of the building yielded no results. John had disappeared without a trace, and no one could explain what had happened to him. His colleagues were shocked, but the management considered it an isolated incident and continued with business as usual. However, new oddities started happening at the warehouse. People who worked there began noticing that the shadows on the walls were behaving strangely, and footsteps echoed in empty corridors. Over time, they began to realize that John hadn't just disappeared, he had become part of this cursed place, and now his spirit would forever roam the dark corridors, trapped in his own nightmare.